what I want to do today is try to give kind of an overall outline structure to all of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. And I think the easiest way to do that is sort of chronologically, and sort of what broad eras of time are we dealing with. So the first page of your notes, I'm calling dates to know, and there are 4 of them that are in bold. On my printout, it's a little hard to see what's bold and what's not, but the 4 dates that I hope you can kind of have in your head as reference points at all times, these are the only ones that are worth memorizing necessarily, are first of all 1250 BCE, and those of you who are part of the Hebrew scriptures class should recognize that as the date of the exodus of the underclass from Egypt to set out and eventually become the nation of Israel. All right, that's that. The one potential answer to where does the Bible begin, right, is in that moment when those slaves escape from captivity in Egypt and have to become something or perish, you know, out in the wilderness. We are quite confident that everything in the Hebrew scriptures that purports to recount anything that happened before that date is written in retrospect. Okay, there is nothing that is written before 1250. You know, when they talk about the creation, they're talking about from the point of now, something that happened long ago. There may actually be a text or two in the Old Testament that actually dates from around the time of the Exodus. That's that bit. That's that bit. Okay. Then the second one that I think everybody pretty much has in their head from last year is 70 CE, which is the
only thing I remember.
Pardon?
I just said the only thing I can remember. It's
okay. So
that is engraved on my brain.
There you go. That's my goal, is to get these 4 numbers engraved in your brain, and then they become hooks, you know, in which you can hang everything else as being before or after those significant moments. So the Exodus and then the destruction of the temple, which in some ways are bookends to the Jewish scripture period, right? Or at least there's a major transition in Jewish scripture after 70 AD, and we don't call it part of the Bible or the Tanakh or the Torah anymore, the scripture that's generated after that. Okay, so then the new ones that we're going to be coming back to again and again and again as we look at the history of religion in the Western world going forward are going to be 325, and 325 is the Council of Nicaea. So that gives you a centering date for Constantine. Constantine did a number of other things, but one of the memorable things that he did was to call that council, to bring the leaders of the Christian sect, the bishops, together in Nicaea in 325 to say, what is Christianity? If it's going to be a recognized religion, if it's going to be a political force in the empire, you're going to have to tell me what it is. And so before that, there is no consensus about Christian doctrine. It's a free-for-all. Every bishop can teach what they think Paul said and what Paul thinks Jesus said, and so on backwards. So there's a lot of conflict, and we'll be talking about what some of that conflict was. But once you get past 325, then there is a perception that there is a body that has the authority to make a decision about what constitutes Orthodox Christianity and what constitutes heresy. All right. Everybody know what heresy means? the original root comes from the verb to choose. So a heretic is someone who chooses their own beliefs as opposed to being informed by the authorities what those beliefs should be. And that concept that there is a correct Christianity and an incorrect Christianity really gets solidified with the Council of Nicaea. So it's a bookend. It's the end of the period of ferment that really is that 300 years between the death of Jesus, and that involves the creation of the Gospels, the creation of the letters of Paul, the emergence of a Christian canon, although the canon's not sealed in 325. But the concept that, unlike Judaism, because that Jewish conversation about what constitutes correct Judaism, I mean, remember, we had at least 4 definitions of what that might be at the time of Jesus, right? And it's never been resolved to this day, right? Because to this day, we have the Orthodox and we have the Reform. And so that conversation is still going on. The Christians are going to want to do that differently. They're going to reject that Jewish model of just an ongoing dialogue. And they're going to start saying, we are right and these other people are wrong about what Christianity is. But up until about 325, you had no basis to stand on to make that claim. So that's why 325 is kind of a cutoff date, an important date. And then the final one that some of us may carry around without even knowing it is 1517, which is when the Catholic monk Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the bulletin board in Wittenberg on the cathedral door and said, I dare anybody to challenge me about these ideas. And that was what kicked off the Protestant Reformation in an institutional, enduring sort of format. So you have a period of creativity and ferment and uncertainty for the first 300 years of Christianity. And then you have about 1,200 years of the aspiration that Christianity is one thing, that there is one acceptable definition of what constitutes real Christianity. Now, of course, it's never going to actually be that simple, but that's the ideal. That's the supposition that if we could just eliminate all the people who have these weird, wrong ideas, then we would have some sort of pure, unified, orthodox, correct Christianity. Once you get past 1517, you'll never have that again, because now you're going to have all the different Protestant churches and the recognition that none of those churches can claim universality. The Catholics may have certain nations where they have the power. The Protestants may have certain nations where they have the power. But what they have to come to recognize is that there are other nations that disagree with them. And before that, you had this idea of hegemony, is what you call it, that Christianity was the hegemony of at least Western Europe, that the Roman Catholic Church was the one true church. That's how it thought of itself, and that's how people thought of it. So those 4 days, if don't bother to learn any other dates by heart, but try and get those 4, because they'll be really handy in the long run. All right.
When Kendall?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
When they did that 325 thing, did they also establish sort of an ongoing group who decided who was in and out, and a sort of a organization that lasted for 1,200 years, or did it kind of come together over a period of time.
What they established was the idea that there should be such a group. Who was going to constitute that group was never established beyond challenge. All right. So initially there was a sense that it was the 5 bishops of the most important sees or areas, and we'll talk a little bit about that next time, or maybe this time if we get around to it. So the idea, and you still get this even to this day, you get these councils. The Catholic Church, the Pope and the cardinals will call a council, right? And they will come together, I mean, physically, traditionally, but maybe not so much anymore, to try and hash things out, you know, within the Catholic Church and figure out what is correct doctrine going to be, right? So that process within the Catholic Church was one way that they thought about it. Yeah, Peggy.
Was there a pope in 325, or when was the first pope officially named?
Well, here's an interesting question. What is the Pope? The Pope is basically the Bishop of Rome.
Rome, yeah.
So yes, there was a Bishop of Rome. In 325, the Bishop of Rome did not necessarily have all the authority that would eventually accumulate for that position. So yes, there was a person living in Rome who was the authority over the Roman Church, but the Bishop of Alexandria and the Bishop of Constantinople at least imagined themselves to have equal power at that time.
Okay.
So it will be a while more before everybody else is looking to the Bishop of Rome as being the superior authority over everybody else. So it kind of depends on what you mean by Pope.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Does that happen before 1517?
Oh yeah. yes. Well before. Yeah, within a fairly short period of time, because once you have the idea that there should be an authority, then figuring out who that is becomes a fairly urgent question, right? And so it didn't take too long before people started saying, well, and part of it was that the locus of political power was Rome. And so the secular authorities of Rome had the power, even in 325, to either sponsor oppressions of Christianity or forbid oppressions of Christianity from the secular political angle. So that means that the person who is there, physically there in Rome representing the Christian church, is an important player, right? Because they're the one that has the ear of the emperor, or has ticked off the emperor, or what, you know, whatever that relationship is, it's going to have an impact on the way in which Roman authority administers the whole empire with regard to Christianity. So the bishop in Rome has a lot of influence, more than the other bishops would have perhaps preferred. And we'll talk about when Constantine died, there will come to be this theory a couple centuries later that basically on his deathbed, in addition to being baptized, Constantine turned over the secular power of the Roman government to the church, the Christian church, the Catholic Church. And we'll start saying Roman Catholic in a little while, but not quite yet. And they actually come up with a document. It's called the Donation of Constantine, where not only, I mean, we can historically prove some of the letters and pronouncements in which Constantine says, first of all, Christians are not to be persecuted, and then later Christianity will be the official religion of the empire. That stuff historically we can demonstrate. This notion that he said, and the church should be in charge of all the secular power of the empire, was not, there is not the enduring historical evidence for that. So at one point, somebody came up with a document and said, oh, here it is. This is the document in which he did that. And one of the things that's going to kick off the Renaissance is going to be the demonstration that that document is a forgery, is a later historical attempt to go back and allege that Constantine did something that he didn't actually do. Yeah, Peggy.
So that is why it was so important. I didn't understand at the time, but that's why it was so important when the Pope declared that Charlemagne was the rightful heir of Constantine. Because that made that, it's like he was holding the power since Constantine died, and now he's going to give it to Charlemagne.
Right, correct.
That begins the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
Okay,
right.
that
right.
makes a lot of sense now.
Right. But it only works if in fact Constantine did that, which there's pretty good historical reason to believe he didn't actually do. So,
or you can convince people he did that.
Right, exactly, right. But that was the theory,
yeah.
Or the explanation to justify that. And so it was a big deal when there was intellectually convincing proof that that was not true. That threw the whole authority of the church as it had gathered at that point up into question again. And so that's you can argue that that is the earliest seat of the Reformation, 200 years before it actually happened. 300 maybe even. Okay, so let's look at this first page of dates, because these are all significant time frames, and you can, if you kind of go through and look at what's the difference, how many years are there between each of these 11 or whatever dates that we have on the first page here, you can kind of get a sense of eras between the beginning of Judaism and the beginning of the Reformation. There are chunks in there. So you have the exodus of the slaves from Egypt down through the death of King David in 970. These are all before the Common Era. And King David represents the establishment of Jerusalem as a central focus for the nation of Israel as its capital, which up until the time of David it wasn't, of its becoming not only the secular center of political power, but also the cult center, that David builds the temple, where the physical building, which the Jewish faith before the Yahweh cult has never had that until David. So his death in 970 is also a watershed. It's a turning point for the development of Judaism. Okay, you go from there to 597 before the Common Era is the fall of Jerusalem and the beginning of the Babylonian captivity for the leaders of the nation of Israel. And that is that shaping experience where they figure out that, oh, actually we can be a religion even in the absence of the physical temple, right? So you have 400-ish years there where the temple is the thing. And then they're swept away from it, and it becomes a ruin kind of while they're gone. So they have to realize that they can worship their God. They can believe that their God is still in covenant with them, even though they no longer have access to the temple or the rituals that went on there, right? Okay, as we know, eventually they were allowed to go back. And what happened next was Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great conquered the known world. So when he died in 323 before the Common Era, Israel had been kind of swept up in the same dustpan as Egypt and Syria and Mesopotamia and all the other areas of Italy and the southern Mediterranean that Alexander the Great had conquered. So that was a huge cultural shift that made them part of a larger political network that Alexander created but never really got to administer very well. But Hellenism, the effect of Greek culture, Greek intellectual culture, Greek language, Greek philosophy and thinking became sort of a common heritage among what was at that time for most people, for all intents and purposes, the known world, right? So that even Israel is this nation that has its own weird little religious thing, but it's also part of a much larger cultural construct that includes what is initially Alexander's empire and what will become the Roman Empire. Does that make sense? So the death of Alexander is the end of his conquest and the beginning of the effort to keep that conquered area in some sort of coherent political integrity. Now, it doesn't work very well a lot of the time, but that's the effort that's going on. So Jesus, as we know, is born in Israel when it is under Roman domination, right? So that, which is part of the fallout of the Alexander's empire. And Jesus, as a revolutionary, resists the domination of Rome and is killed in 33 of what is now the Common Era. So we have the transition from the before dates to the after dates. Right? And then not quite 40 years later, we have the final destruction of the Jewish temple and the fall of Jerusalem to the Roman forces, who understand themselves to be putting down a sort of local insurrection. But what they effectively do is to turn Judaism into what we call rabbinic Judaism or synagogue Judaism. In other words, there is no more temple, there's no more central cult, there's no more ritual priesthood. It has to become a different kind of proposition in order to survive, and it does. And the same thing happens with the emergent cult of Christianity at that time. It also cannot remain a Jerusalem-focused Jewish cult. It has to become something else if it's going to survive, which it does. Then the next significant date is the Council of Nicaea in 325, which creates the notion of an orthodox, authoritarian Christianity, which was not what Christianity was before. Then the next important date segment is, I'm establishing 629 as the beginning of Islam. That is the year when Muhammad returns from Medina to Mecca and throws all the idols out of the Kaaba and establishes Islam as a kind of national or even multinational faith. So at that point, Christianity now has a competitor for hegemony in the known Western world. Does that make sense? Before that, there was really no other alternative. There were bits and pieces of what they thought of as paganism or heathenism, pockets here and there, but there was no centralized, established, alternate faith that people could do. I mean, there was Judaism, but Judaism was fairly effectively oppressed at that point. And so the rise of Islam is going to shift Christianity's understanding of itself and its sense that it was going to, in the course of nature, by providence, eventually dominate the world. They suddenly thought, oops, maybe that might not be right. Anna, you were going to ask a question? Yeah.
You said competitor for the hegemony in the known Western world.
Right.
So when you use the word Western world and Islam, so are you saying anything west of Eastern Asia?
Right. I'm not talking about the world of Buddhism, Confucianism, the China, Japan.
Okay.
There are some slender strands of connection, but by and large, I mean, Christianity did not pay any attention to what was happening with Buddhism, right? That was not of interest to them. It was not significant to them. It might as well have been on another planet.
Mm-hmm.
Islam was not on another planet. Islam was all up in Jerusalem, right? So that mattered. That was important. And as far as they were concerned, the known world, except for people who were trading on the Silk Road, the known world was the area around the Mediterranean.
Okay. And the Near East
Well, yeah, I mean, Egypt, Israel, Syria,
Yeah.
all of those. When we talk about the 5 C's, the 5 bishops, you'll see how they make sort of a curve around the Mediterranean. But much out beyond that, in any direction, you have what are considered barbarians, basically, until you get to the Chinese civilizations.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's a whole, like I say, a whole different world. So I just want to recognize that there's a lot of history, a lot of theology, a lot of philosophy, a lot of science going on over there in China and Japan and the Southern Asian areas. What's happening in Europe in the West is not the only thing that's happening, but that's what we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to be clear about that, because we tend to learn history as if, you know, the Chinese were all sort of crazy mandarins for this whole time, and that's not at all true.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating in its own right, but it's more than we can deal with at the moment.
Yeah.
All right. So then in 1054, and if you were going to add one more date to remember, this would be it. That is the formal final schism between Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox Church. So for that first 1,000 years, or if you want to see institutional Christianity as beginning in the 300s with the Council of Nicaea, for that first 700 years, that it was one thing, or it was trying to be one thing. But by 1054, they finally gave up and said, listen, Western Christianity is centered in Rome. The Bishop of Rome, who's the Pope, is the authority there. It is clear now that basically the Pope of the Eastern Church, who's formerly known as the Patriarch of the Eastern Church, is now going to be the authority for the Eastern Orthodox Church. We cannot come to terms. We cannot get our act together in such a way that these two different cultures and understandings of Christianity and sources of authority can figure out how to be together. So we're just going to separate. And basically what they did was each one excommunicated the other. And so it's like, you all are going to hell. Well, no, you all are going to hell, you know. So there was no more cooperation or sense of connection after that between those two forms of Christianity. So when you say Roman Catholicism, you're really talking about Western half of what was there after that schism. Now, that's not to say that, like other things, that schism doesn't have really deep roots that go back a long way. But
Kendall?
1054 is when it's a done deal. At that point, there's no hope of putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Yeah, Kate.
Am I remembering
Uh,
correctly that within the last not too many years, well, within my generation, they finally did reach some reapportionment?
Well, they actually, there have been efforts toward that for, I mean, ever since it happened,
Yeah.
you know, for centuries, people have been saying, wait, can't we figure this out? Can't we undo this? And, you know, a lot of it's cultural because the Eastern Orthodox allowed married clergy, and, you know, there were some institutional kinds of things. And of course, the worship, the liturgy split, and the language that was used for liturgy was Latin in the West and Greek in the East. And so that was a barrier too. So there's always this thought about, come on, we're all Christians here, aren't we really? But they've never succeeded. And so they've gotten to the point now where they will admit each other exists and maybe they're not going to hell, right? And there are a small handful of married Roman Catholic clergy, and they are in general priests who have transferred over from the Eastern Orthodox to the Western Roman Catholic Church. And because of that special thing where they have actually received Christian Catholic ordination, they can come over and they can keep the wife that they've got. Now, if she dies, they can't marry again once they're Roman Catholic clergy. But so there was a time when they couldn't take communion from each other because they'd been excommunicated, and I think they've gotten back to where they can take communion from each other. But it's still, there's an institutional tension, shall we say, between the two groups, which is partly theological, but
Kendall?
largely, I would say, cultural at this point.
Too many lawyers.
Kendall?
Yeah. Yes.
It's not going. So I'm listening to you. So when they split, it was largely cultural. It was still the same body of Christianity, theology-wise, kind of, but it says, hey, this is how we're going to do it, and you guys can do it that way, but you're wrong, and
Yeah,
we're right.
Right.
Of cultural.
Right. We're both serving God, you in your way and us in his. You know, that was the theory. And, you know, allegedly it was theological. Allegedly it was that each group thought the other was preaching heresy. But, you know, we see many examples in the Western Church where they dealt with heresy one way or another. Either they stamped it out, or they incorporated it, or they managed it in some way that didn't split the institution. In this case, my personal perception is that once you divided up the Roman Empire and said, okay, you co-emperor are going to administer the West, and you co-emperor are going to administer the East, because we can't, you know, it's, when you think about communication and armies and stuff, how do you control an area that goes from, you know, the Russian edge of Turkey all the way over to Britain? You know, I mean, you can't get messages, you can't get armies, you can't, it's just so top heavy and complicated to try to have a central administration that controls all that area. The plus of which, you know, once you have hereditary element in the emperorship, the kids are always killing each other off, and sometimes their father, and, you know, to try and get hold of that thing. So it absolutely made more administrative sense at some point to say, all right, you take that half and your armies concentrate on that side, and you take that half and your armies concentrate on that side. Once you do that politically, and you still have competition going on among the important cities and the important bishophoods, bishoprics they're called, or sees, it's hard not to see that the religious administration will follow suit. You know, that you're going to get the same kind of split theologically and liturgically, especially once you start having a separate language. You know, if these guys over here all speaking Greek and these guys over here all speaking Latin, you're done for in terms of, you know, holding on to institutional unity. It would be a miracle, you know, if that happened, and the miracle did not occur. Yeah, Peggy.
And they clearly saw themselves, whether they officially called it or not, they clearly saw themselves as two different religions in a way, at least as early as 800. I mean, at the time of the iconoclastic controversy, when they banned religious imagery in the East, I mean, the West paid no attention to that whatsoever. And there have been any number of things like that where they just didn't admit they were two different churches, but almost from the very beginning, everybody knew they were two completely different churches.
Right. And they were from the start. They were before 325. You know, I mean, 325 was an artificial attempt to force a unity or a uniformity that did not exist. It didn't exist before 325. It didn't exist after 325. It never actually existed. But they created this ideal or this image that that's how it was supposed to be. And so that's why they kept saying, well, we're supposed to be in this together. We're supposed to agree about this, and having these fights. And so when they finally said, you know, you guys are so wrong that there's no dealing with you and we're just going to excommunicate you, that was only the fruit of that very long process of very different cultures, very different intellectual evolutions in the way they understood theology, you know, different impact of the encounter with Islam, you know, how that affected those groups. There were lots of reasons, why they came apart. It didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't just that somebody got up grumpy in 1054 and said, oh, let's excommunicate them. The roots were laid for a long, long time. Yeah, Anna.
When you said the Western was centered in Rome, the Eastern was centered in Constantinople?
That's correct. Okay. Very good. Yep. That's right. Okay, so that, and then, you know, it's a little less than 500 years later, we get the Protestant Reformation. And of course, a lot happens in that 500 years. You got the Renaissance and, you know, Crusades and other interesting things happen in there. But yes, Kay.
Well, wasn't Unitarianism fermenting during those years? Or was it all after the Reformation? Because I thought that, I'm sorry, the guy, I was want to say Severus
Servetus.
Guy from Spain.
Servetus.
After.
Yeah, wasn't he earlier than that?
Well, he was born in 1511. So not much before that. But one of the most vexed questions, one of the things there was a lot of argument and competition about in 325 at the Council of Nicaea was whether or not Jesus was God.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you want to trace
gods, yeah,
the intellectual roots of Unitarianism, they go all the way back to before, you know, to that era when everything was up for grabs, when Christianity was just beginning to crystallize into a thing. And one of the things that had to crystallize was whether, I mean, first of all, you had to choose between Pauline Christianity and Jerusalem or Galilean Christianity. And once that choice was kind of made, then you had to figure out what Paul meant by a lot of the stuff that he was talking about, right? And so one of those is, okay, how do we think about Jesus? Is Jesus a human being? Is Jesus God pretending to be a human being? What is that? And the reality is that the powers that be didn't want to come down on one side or the other, and so they didn't. They basically said, oh, it's the Trinity, it's a mystery. But there were always people who were saying, that doesn't make any sense. Was he or wasn't he? And there were always groups that said, this was God. This was just like Zeus showing up as a bull so he can impregnate, the local maiden. That's exactly what this was, because that was the idea people were familiar with, right? I mean, it made sense to everybody. There's, God kind of walked around in a Jesus suit for a while and was AWOL from heaven. And then Jesus died, and now God's back in heaven without his Jesus suit anymore. And, he could do it again if he felt like it, kind of. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is that, well, Jesus was inspired and had this kind of mystical connection, kind of like the prophets of ancient Judaism, right? That God talked to him and told him how to live and what to tell people and what to do. So he was this very, very holy, sensitive, connected guy who was a human being, but he just had a really good relationship with God, and God informed his life in a way. Okay, that makes sense. We understand that. We understand what it means to be a prophet. Or you can even look at someone like Elagabalus, we talked about last time, who understood himself as the priest of this god, this Syrian god, who was like his representative on earth. Right? The Egyptians had this with their pharaohs too, right? Like the pharaoh was kind of the presence of God, the word of God, the representative of God in the world. But they were human beings first, and then they kind of got this connection with God. So that was another possibility. And then there's this weird sort of combination that they came up with that said, well, God was not absent from heaven, but Jesus is also God, and the Holy Spirit is also God, and that's the idea of the Trinity. And the church has been trying to figure out how to make people understand this for, about 1,700 years at this point. So does that feel like you get kind of those big chunks of how we're dividing this up? And we'll look at little bits and pieces within each of these, but it'll be helpful if you can kind of say, all right, that's in the period between the death of Jesus and the destruction of the temple, or that's in the period between when Islam comes on the scene and when you get the schism between the Eastern and the Western Church, those little segments, if you will. Yeah, Anna.
This is unrelated, but when some people say Jesus will return to earth and do whatever it is he's going to do, I mean, are they part of this group that thinks, I mean, I was just picturing the Jesus suit. Is that God in the Jesus suit coming back? I mean, well, I have such a hard time understanding what they're talking about.
Right. The people who believe in the return of Jesus are generally Trinitarians, which means that they think the best I can explain it is, you know what a fractal is?
No.
Okay.
A piece of something?
Right. So a fractal is a thing like a fern or a seashell where the pattern replicates itself, right? So the big frond of the fern does this, and then the little frond that's attached to that does this, and then the little thing that's on the end of that frond does this. So at at each level of scale, it's the same form. All right. So the only way that, well, one of the ways that the Trinity makes sense to me is that God is a fractal. So the whole fractal is still out there whole, but the other fractal that contains all the same information and structure is coming back to Earth in the form of Jesus. All right. So it doesn't take anything away from God as a whole. It's not like God the Father's walking around heaven without an arm. You know, he's there the same way he's always been, but then this other incarnation obviously is going to show up on the earth and do the will of God as a whole entity, because Jesus as a small fractal is thinking the same things and wanting the same things and creating the same reality that God as the larger fractal is creating.
Okay.
And meanwhile, we have that third element of the fractal, which is the Holy Spirit, that is present now. So we have it with us. It's not totally gone away into heaven. But maybe you and I experience it, but other people don't. You know, that's a possibility.
Oh, the Holy Spirit is what some of us are blessed to have.
Right.
I see. Thank you.
Be aware of.
This is very confusing and very helpful.
Yeah, you know, there has yet to be a generation that hasn't struggled with figuring out what is this Trinity thing. I mean, what was it that they came up with some sort of solution that nobody has ever really been able to wrap their minds around entirely. And I love it when William Ellery Channing describes it as God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit being shut up in one jar. That's the way the Unitarians have kind of always said, you're putting three things that are not the same thing in one jar and saying they're all the same thing, and it doesn't work. And that same argument was going on in 325 at the Council of Nicaea. And the interesting thing is that Constantine and his confessor, his spiritual leader, the person that had the most authority in his life, and those who were close to him, they were all Arians, which is to say that they were all Unitarians. They all thought that Jesus was a human being who was especially blessed and connected to God. But they were not Trinitarians. And so when the Council of Nicaea, we'll talk more about this subsequently, came down on the side of the Trinitarians, the Athanasians, basically, there were two bishops, the Bishop Arius and the Bishop Athanasius. Athanasius was arguing for the Trinitarian view, and Arius was arguing for the Unitarian view, basically. Athanasius won out at the Council of Nicaea, and he got Arius banished for heresy, right? And then Constantine came back into the picture and said, no, call that guy back. I really like him better, and banished Athanasius for a while. And then Constantine died, and the political climate shifted, and Athanasius won in the end. But that just shows you how fragile these conclusions were. You know, it depended on who had popular power within the religious community, who had political power within the secular community, who died. You know, I mean, it's whose city got conquered or had a flood, or, you know, I mean, lots of things could happen to make your theological position untenable that had nothing to do with the theology, actually. All right, any other questions about these kind of larger segments? If not, I'm going to shift to the next page, which is a more a finer tooth comb, if you will, in terms of talking about some of these eras. And one of the most politically correct ways of talking about this that we used to do at the University of Chicago at the Div School, if you said 0 to 1500, everyone knew what you were talking about, which is basically the history of Western Christianity in the period between the life of Jesus and the start of the Reformation. But it's almost any other way you try to talk about it, it becomes a political landmine. So we always used to just say 0 to 1500, you know, and that was assumed you were including the rise of Islam in that too. So that's why I've got that title on there, so we can get used to using that locution. So obviously you start with the death of Jesus, that is a historical, political fact that that Rome was having to deal with, that the Jewish community was having to deal with, that his followers were having to deal with. That was a thing that happened and set a lot of things in motion. And it's only 31 years later that you have these communities, these proto-church Christian communities all over the map, because that's what the Apostle Paul has been industriously running around and doing, right? He's gathering together these groups, starting out in the synagogues, you know, collecting whatever disaffected Jews he could get his hands on, but then reaching out into the larger community and inviting people who were basically Roman citizens or inhabitants of a Roman-dominated culture who may have been pagans of one sort or another, to come and be part of this cult. And that has happened also in Rome. There's a Roman church. There's a letter that was written in Paul's name, perhaps not by Paul, to the church in Rome, to the Romans. And so we know that there is a small group who consider themselves Christians living in Rome. And like the Jews, they are somewhat suspect, because why? We've been talking about this. Why are they looked upon askance in Rome?
For one thing, they wouldn't recognize the cult of the emperor.
Right. They didn't want to worship the emperor. That's exactly right. And you know, the Jews had been in some ways grandfathered in, almost sort of literally. That everybody knows that the Jews are, you know, bizarre about this, and you're only going to make trouble if you try to get them to do it. So just, you know, recognize that they're weird about this thing and they're not going to do it, so leave them alone. And because Christianity was at some level a variation of Judaism, some people felt like, well, okay, the Christians are basically Jews also, so they're also not going to be cooperative on this. But then other people thought, well, they're saying they don't have to be Jews. And moreover, we're putting up with the Jews because they're grandfathered in, because they are obeying a tradition in their own culture that goes way, way back. Part of what we as Romans value about our religious rituals is that they go way, way back, right? These Christians made this stuff up yesterday, right? So they don't go way, way back. Where did they get off demanding to not be under the same authority that we're under? So while they were in a very precarious, ambiguous kind of position, some people thought they should be tolerated just because they were insignificant and weird. Other people thought they should be tolerated because they were kind of on the coattails of the Jews and we already tolerate them. And other people thought they should not be tolerated because they're not worshiping the emperor, right? So Nero, who we all know was kind of a bad guy, kind of took advantage of this, and he had his eye on some real estate. He wanted to do urban renewal in Rome and build a new neighborhood, and with some you know, he wanted to build Trump Tower basically and put Nero across the top in lights. But people lived there. And of course, people lived, if they were not very prosperous, in basically shacks, in wooden shacks with thatched roofs, and I mean, in very flammable places, basically. So the historical theory is Nero had this neighborhood burned out through arson. He hired a bunch of arsonists, and they went and they cleared the area so that he could take it over for his building programs. Obviously, this caused a lot of distress. And so his solution to that was to blame it on the Christians, that the Christians were responsible for these fires. Now, there's a particular scandal that goes along with this. So maybe this is, do we want to take a break? Would people like a bio break for a few minutes, and I'll just tease you with the scandal that's out there about the Christians, and that way you'll come back in 5 minutes, okay? All right, let's take a break for a few minutes. I, of course, cannot go anywhere because the cat is in my lap, so.
Of course.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is related much later about Martin Luther when he did his thing, and that was 3 years ago. It was the 500th anniversary of that.
Right.
I don't recall. Was that a big deal among the Protestants in the world?
Well,
big celebration, commemoration. Or?
yes, I did a service on it. I don't know if anyone remembers, but for some Protestants, yes. Now you have to remember that Luther was what we call a magisterial Protestant, which is to say he basically wanted to keep the Catholic Church more or less intact, only get rid of the Pope and the corruptions.
Mm-hmm.
So he was in favor, for instance, of clergy being married. He wanted the church to be clearly subservient to the civil order. You know, he did not want the Pope crowning the emperor or anything like that. He wanted rid of the Pope. He wanted the church as had a kind of almost Roman view of it. He wanted the church as a solidifier of the social order. But he was not at all interested in entertaining people with diverse views. So he was opposed to the Calvinists. He was certainly opposed to the Anabaptists. You know, there were no other Protestants that he supported. So for the majority of today's Protestants, Luther is a somewhat ambiguous spiritual ancestor because their traditions probably were initially oppressed by him, even though he's also the one who kind of kicked the whole thing off. Does that make sense?
Sure does. Yeah, thanks.
One of the things, Kendall,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
One of the things I ran across was this Scottish historian, Neil Ferguson. He said he had a lecture on the internet, but he said one of the interesting things he found being a historian was the advent of printing and the rise of the Protestant Reformation. They were able to grow that fast.
Right.
You covered how the culture in the background influenced the religion.
Sure.
And his theory was that all the changes in Europe going, including the advancement of printing, helped spread that stuff remarkably speedier.
Oh. Martin Luther would be a very obscure monk with some weird ideas if it hadn't been for the printing press. Absolutely. And by the same token, there have been Martin Luthers in every generation who got nowhere because they didn't have the printing press. So yes, I would say he's absolutely right about that.
So it sounds like Paul was Jesus' printing press.
Yes, yes, right.
Right. And now the internet is causing
Yeah.
more, even more. Now we got
right.
gamesters all over the world, and now everything else has gone downhill, right?
Well,
We got Twitter and TikTok.
yeah, yeah. But, you know, I tend to think that the more information is accessible, the better off we are. And I realize that that has its downside, but I also think that all other things being equal, I would rather live in a world with the printing press, and all other things being equal, I would rather live in a world with the internet. That
Yeah.
making
Game
knowledge
of
scarce
Thrones is
is,
just a game, right?
say that again? What's just a game?
Game of Thrones is
Oh,
only a game. Don't try to do it in real life, right?
but well, I'm afraid that Game of Thrones may have a few too many analogies in real life.
I think
But
we've already done most of it.
yeah, right, really. You know, I will finish our break with this irrelevant observation, which is, I think Game of Thrones is a very interesting counter narrative to what we have all been educated to believe about the nature of democracy. You know, which is that there is some sort of moral context for the holding and using of power that will ultimately triumph. And I think the whole premise of Game of Thrones is that's not true. Whoever has the power, and what they do with it is what they do with it. And I think what we're seeing right now in our political situation is that that is more true than that, you know, the will of the people is ultimately the voice of God. We like to think that, but I'm not sure that it's as true as we've been invited to believe. So the scandal of Christianity, there were two actually, and these may sound familiar because they keep coming up again and again when there are unpopular cults. The first one was that they practiced cannibalism. Now, why would anybody think that the Christian sect practiced cannibalism, Peggy?
Eating the body of Christ and drinking his blood.
Right, absolutely. And even though that was more of an analogy in the early church than it would later become, it would later take on much more literal context, to outsiders, it sounded shocking. You know, it sounded like, ew, who would do that? It's like we look at it and say, you know, why would you want the blood of a goat all over your altar? You know, I mean, what's good about that? People were just sort of grossed out by that idea. The other scandal about Christianity was that they were accused of committing incest. And that really had to do a lot with Paul's terminology that he says several different times in different letters, you know, greet one another with a brotherly and sisterly kiss, basically. That was like a secret handshake in the Christian community. It was part of their sense of, you know, we consider each other equals, we consider each other as kin, we're in this together. Well, again, when outsiders heard that, it's like, oh my God, the brothers and sisters are kissing each other, they're committing incest. And so they had this theory that when the Christians got together, this is the sort of National Enquirer, summary of what happened when Christians got together, was that not only did they engage in cannibalism, but that they were at each other's houses, usually for an evening meal after dark, or it would become dark. And there's one account that's really very specific about how this happens, that at the end of the meal, while they're having dessert, they have a dog who's tied up to the lamp post of the central lamp that's an oil burning, you know, illuminating this thing. And while they're having dessert, someone will tease the dog with a little scrap of dessert, and the dog will pull over the lampstand, and then it's dark. And then they can have these outrageous orgies, and nobody knows, you know, whether they're with their brother or sister or who they're with. I mean, that's the That's the scandal of Christianity. So Nero takes this theory and says, oh yeah, that it was them knocking over their lampstands. They're the ones that set fire to this neighborhood that I wanted to get rid of. So he blames a group that's already scandalous and unpopular for something that he did, by using against them this kind of conspiracy reputation, right? That's going around about who they are. And it's not so much a government persecution. There will be later government persecutions, as it is kind of a stand down order to the soldiers and the government officials to not intervene, but inciting the mobs to go out and beat up the Christians or kill them or punish them for having burned down everybody's houses. So that, I mean, on the one hand, you can say that that's the first official persecution because it is the emperor saying, don't help them, basically, don't do anything to stop this. But it's not the same thing as kind of having officials going out, asking people if they're Christians and putting them on trial. That will come later. Everybody kind of understand what's happening in 64 there. That also the tradition is that Paul is in Rome during this time and that he is executed as a leader of this sort of rabble-rousing group at that time. So that's the end of his influence. And then 6 years later, you get this finally, okay, we've had it with these Jews revolting and, trying to take back their temple and take back their city and their nation. And we're going to settle their hash once and for all. So we're going to send, I forget what it was, 100,000 soldiers or something over there and just, sack Jerusalem and don't leave enough of it standing that they can do anything about that. And what that does is to scatter both the institutional authority of the Jewish community and the structure of the Jerusalem Christians, who were the only ones who were really giving Paul's version of it any kind of competition. So does that all make sense of what's going on in that really early period there?
Is Nero still in charge in 70 when that sacking happens?
No.
I don't
He's
think
dead.
so. No.
No,
I think
Titus was the emperor at that time. Remember we looked at Titus? We looked at that triumphal arch that was built for him and he was on the arch. Nero was assassinated pretty soon after he built his villa. He built a huge villa on that site. And then they burned that down and built the Colosseum.
That's
the next emperor, remember, built the Colosseum as a gift to the Roman people because he didn't want to be linked to Nero.
Right. It's like, why are you living in this guy's house? No, I'm not. We made a stadium out of it.
Right.
Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
Nero was not a popular guy. I mean, he was very sort of Trump-like. I mean, you can just imagine Trump blaming, the early Christians. Because
I was just going to say that. It sounds like something Trump would do.
Exactly.
Well, he does do.
Yes, he does do. Right.
And then he incites the mobs to take care of it, which he does do.
Right.
Exactly.
Yep.
And
So
Nero
it's
was
not
never a soldier. That's why one reason they hated him.
Right.
You were never going to be successful as a Roman emperor if you hadn't proven yourself in the military as a general. And he was never in the military. He had no chance.
Right. Yeah. But he was also a pretty awful.
Yeah.
I mean, he was
a jerk.
He was bad at the job and he was a jerk. Yeah, right. So between those two things, he was going to be assassinated before too long.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next sort of chapter, if you will, is you begin to get these really crazy emperors. I mean, Nero's a good example early on, but then you get people like Elagabalus in 222, and then in 250, there's this interesting decree, if you will, by Decius. And he's one of the first to make this an official empire-wide requirement that every citizen is required to make a sacrifice, and be advised about the language here, on behalf of the emperor and the Roman state. So this is like saying we need everybody to pray for the emperor. And that's something that many Christians were perfectly okay doing, that they were willing to pray for the emperor. You know, it's sort of like the blessing in Fiddler on the Roof, you know, may the Lord bless and keep the Tsar far away from us. You can always find a way to pray for somebody. But he was not asking them to pray to the emperor or to the Roman state. And so that sort of grammatical switch is going to be significant later when the Christians start saying, well, we are not going to pray to the emperor. Well, are you really being asked to pray to the emperor? Or are you being asked to pray for the emperor? And if you make a sacrifice on the emperor's behalf, is that or is that not permitted if you are a Jewish person, if you are a Christian person? Now, a lot of the Jews were very clear that no, I am not going to make a sacrifice on behalf of the emperor or on behalf of the Roman state. Might say a prayer, that's okay, but that sort of ritual action, no, that's not going to fly. And a lot of the Christians felt the same way, that they were no longer part of a sacrificial cult. The only sacrifice they participated in was the Eucharist, the eating of the sacred meal. Anything else demonstrated their idea that there was some virtue or some power in some other God, in some other religious system. And so if you were going to be a faithful Christian, you were going to say, no, there are no other gods to sacrifice to. We don't do this kind of thing, so we can't do it. Now, other Christians said, and this should remind you of Paul, one of his big debates, right, was, can you eat meat that was sacrificed to idols or not, right? Remember that Paul had a big thing in the Pauline community, had a big question about that. Because that, like, do you have to be circumcised in order to become a Christian? That was a relevant question for people around the Roman Empire who were saying, well, you know, where are we going to get our meat? Do we have to become Jew? You know, do we have to only patronize the local Jewish butchers, basically? Or can we keep eating the meat that we've always eaten? You know, what do you mean I have to stop shopping at Hy-Vee if I'm going to become a Christian? And so Paul is arguing that you can shop wherever you want. That's not the point, right? Eat whatever meat you want. But then he's also saying, you know, if it's gonna really insult everybody else, do you really have to do it? So he tries to keep a foot in each world, right? Of saying, let's respect what the other members of this little bitty community think is important. On the other hand, if something's been sacrificed to an idol, it's been sacrificed to nothing. It's, you know, that has no power, that there isn't anything there. And so why couldn't you eat the meat? So that same theory is going to come over to the members of the early church dealing with these emperor sacrifices, that some of them are going to say, it means nothing. I don't mean it. You know, I don't believe these gods are real. I don't believe these sacrifices are meaningful. I can just do it to keep out of trouble. And it has no bearing on anything. And others are saying, no, you're acknowledging the importance of these other gods when you do that. And so we're not going to do it. And so that's another tension that's existing in the early church in the Roman world. As we saw last time, in 274, the Emperor Aurelian does this big thing about the cult of hang on one second. We have another 15 minutes to go. I would appreciate not having, okay. Sorry, we repair people who need to be in my studio here. You begin to get this particular cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, that is going to be Constantine's religious orientation until he becomes a Christian. So there's a kind of a clear progression from the general Roman pantheon with options for Mithras and Zoroaster and all those other folks who are floating out there, to the army, in particular, certainly particular members of the army could have their own cult loyalties apart from the general Roman civic cult. But then sometimes units of the army, like troops, they'd have a particular god as their mascot or their protector or whatever. And Sol Invictus becomes very popular as one of these. I mean, he's the unconquered sun, right? No matter what happens in your battle, the sun comes up the next morning. So this would be a good power to have on your side, right? And Constantine, as a soldier and as a general, is going to adopt Sol Invictus as his personal, the God that he serves and the God that he worships and the God whose help he claims in his military career. And so it's not until he's kind of in trouble that he has this vision of Christianity, of Sol Invictus saying to him, check out this Jesus guy, basically. Check out this new cult, see if there's some power here that can help you win. Because he was actually being significantly challenged, Constantine was. So he paints the sign for Jesus on his soldiers' shields, and they actually win the battle. And so in Constantine's mind, there's this kind of fusion between Christianity and Sol Invictus. They're cooperating, they're working together on his behalf. And so the first thing he does is to issue the Edict of Milan in 313. And what that basically does is to remove religious restrictions. So it makes it legal to be a Christian, but it also makes it legal to be a Jew and a bunch of other things at the time. So what he's really doing is saying, we're not going to restrict religious freedom. That's his first move. But what that means is that it's no longer up to the local authorities whether they want to persecute Christians. Because what really happens is there are not very many empire-wide persecutions of Christianity. Mostly there are local persecutions of Christianity, a few of them in Rome, but mostly in various places around the empire. So it really depends who your local governor is. It's much more likely to be that you are hauled before the magistrate of your administrative area than that you're sent to Rome. There's only a few really determined Christians, and the Christians who were not Roman, who were not residents of Rome, kind of vied for this. It was like an honor if you could so annoy the governor of your local province with your Christianity that they would say, I'm sending you to Rome, they can deal with you there. You had accomplished something. That was a martyrdom to be sought. That was an honor. And we have letters from people who were being sent to Rome to the church in Rome, the Christian church in Rome, saying, I'm going to be there in a month, for my trial. Do not interfere. Do not try to rescue me. Do not use your contacts with the local authorities to try to get me off the hook. I want to be a martyr. I want to die the way Jesus did, the way Paul did, the way various saints did. They sought that. So by the time someone was irritating enough about it to get themselves sent to Rome, it was usually because they had intended that. Now, there were lots of people martyred in local areas who weren't probably so enthusiastic about the idea. But what Constantine does is to say, okay, everybody lighten up. I don't care whether you like Christians or not, leave them alone. And that's his sort of first move toward kind of payment for the assistance of the Christian God who helped out Sol Invictus to give them that military victory at the Milvian Bridge. Yeah, Anna.
You said he had the sign of, or the symbol of Jesus painted on their shields. How did the symbol of Jesus come to be? Who came up with that?
The symbol that he was using is called the Chi-Rho. It's Greek letters, and I think it's Christ. It's the two letters that make Christ, but it's basically an X.
Yeah, I looked it up last time you mentioned it last week. But how did that come to be? It was just because it was Greek and they put it together, and that's
it's right. It's from the way the word Christ would be spelled in Greek.
Okay, that's it.
So
okay.
That's what it's like we use the X in Christmas, or abbreviations. It was an abbreviation.
Okay,
basically.
thank you.
Remember those manuscripts we looked at? They were in Latin text, but every time they wanted to say Christ, they put into Greek letters.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
They would do Chi-Rho iota. They would use all Greek.
I remember that. Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah.
And you just read it as Christ. You didn't need to be
Right.
able to read Greek. You recognized that. But it always looks strange to have like one Greek abbreviation. It's really a Greek abbreviation right in the middle of a Latin text.
Right. So it's sort of like the artist formerly known as Prince.
Right.
He had this funny little sign that was supposed to be his name.
Right.
Even though nobody knew how to pronounce it. But if you think about it, it's the same habit of mind that goes back to when you're reading the Jewish scriptures and you see YHY, whatever, Yahweh. You never say Yahweh, right? You say the Lord. And you just have in your head that you always make that substitution. So this was the same thing.
And it's like saint, ST.
ST,
you say
right.
saint, you don't go st.
Right.
It's just the word.
The Peter, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, who were the guys that lost? I mean, who
at
were
the Milvian Bridge.
We never hear about them, Who were they?
Almost certainly a group of what would have been called barbarians, invaders. Might have been from Germany, might have been, usually from the north.
They don't get no respect, huh? We just don't know who they were.
Right.
History
Well,
is written by the victors.
Yeah, right.
The formal fall of Rome, just to give you another date, is often dated to 476, which is when the barbarian Odoacer took the empire insignia, the scepter and the crown and whatever it was, and away from the guy who was supposed to be emperor in the West, and sent them to the emperor in the East. At that point, the division politically administratively had already taken place. So from Odoaker's point of view, he was just saying, I have deposed your deputy in the West, and I'm sending you back the royal insignia. So now it's all, you're it. You, the guy in the East, you're the only emperor anymore, because this guy, I'm not, he's out. And therefore, the empire based in Constantinople continued to consider itself the Roman Empire. As far as they were concerned, yeah, those yahoos over in the West, we don't know what happened to them. But the Roman Empire goes right on until they are conquered by the Turks. And I'll tell you that in 1453. So they got another 700 years or whatever to go before they think that the Roman Empire has fallen. But we who are oriented toward Europe tend to say that the Roman Empire fell in 476.
And that was when, remember, we talked about this in class too. Remember, that was when the Ostrogoths captured Ravenna. And within 100 years, remember, the Eastern Empire goes back and takes it back.
Right.
And that's when we, briefly anyway, and that's when we had those beautiful mosaics in Ravenna.
That beautiful church.
Justinian, yeah.
Yep.
Justinian. But he felt safe to attack the Western capital, which was Ravenna, because it was now in the control of Ostrogoths.
Right.
And that wasn't really the Western Empire anymore.
Right. That's right.
But
he wasn't breaking any oath. He wasn't, attacking one of his own states. He was attacking the aliens and the barbarians.
The barbarians again.
Right. Right.
But they thought of themselves as Roman emperors. I mean, they thought of themselves as, well, now we run the Roman. So they thought that the whole history is like all these competing guys saying they're running the Roman Empire.
Right.
Nobody stops until Napoleon in the 19th century finally gets rid of the last person who thinks of themselves as a Roman emperor. Right. So, in a way, the Roman Empire never ends until the modern era.
You cannot get rid of it.
Of course, it does.
Right. But in terms of, okay. So I'll tell you what, we are going to shortly be invaded by workers. And so let's stop there for the moment. And next week, we'll talk a little bit more about how Constantine moves from this military Sol Invictus cult toward Christianity as a religion for the empire and the impact of that. Okay?
Thank you for recording next week since I'll be gone. I'll look forward to watching.
All right.
Thank you.
And we'll figure out how to tell you where to go to look for them.
It'll all work out. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All righty. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.